Chapter 1. The Normal Life. I had almost forgotten about that summer. Almost. Memory has a way of sanding down the edges of what would otherwise cut you. It leaves shapes, outlines without the blood, the color, the sting. I told myself that was what time did. It softened everything. But time doesn't soften. It simply buries, and it waits for a shovel. My life, for 2 decades, had been the precise geometry of stability. I woke to the sound of my daughter padding across the hardwood floor toward our bed, to the familiar rustle of the Boston Globe outside the door, to the smell of coffee Anna set to brew the night before. I was an architect who loved right angles and clean sight lines, who believed that if you drew your lines straight enough, the mess outside them would respect the boundary. That morning had the color of nickel, a milky sky threatening rain that wouldn't come. The kitchen clock ticked like it measured the space between breaths. Anna hummed under her breath, the same 3 notes, always slightly off-key, as she buttered Emily's toast. Emily insisted on star-shaped slices. I obliged with a cookie cutter I'd once mocked and now used every day. The envelope sat apart from the rest of the mail, as if it had requested an isolated seat. No return address. Thick, creamy paper that felt expensive, willful, like it had chosen to exist. My name was handwritten in black ink I didn't recognize. Not the hurried scratch of a postal worker, not the looping flourish of Anna's lists. A practiced, upright hand, confident. "Who's it from?" Anna asked without looking up. Her robe was tied in a careless knot. A lock of hair fell over her left eye in a way that always made her look younger and a little fierce. "I don't know." I slid a finger under the flap. I thought about jokes I could make, about secret admirers or the IRS, and decided against them. I don't know why. My pulse had already started to tap its own rhythm. Inside was a single photograph. Old, but not ancient. The kind of grain you get from a cheap point-and-shoot, the kind of color that fades to a sickly green. 5 teenagers in the half-light of dusk, shoulder to shoulder, the image slightly canted as if the person behind the camera hadn't quite known how to hold it steady. Me in the center, baseball cap turned backward, dirt smeared along my jaw like a stripe. On my right, Darren, lanky and cocky, the kind of boy whose grin could sell you the rope you'd hang yourself with. On my left, Lisa, beautiful in that unattainable way that made you think of glass, bright and breakable and dangerous if you mishandled it. Behind us, Kyle's lopsided brin and Emily's cautious eyes, the 2 of them framed by a tree line that, even blurred, was unmistakable. The forest. At the bottom, a date scrawled in red marker, not printed. July 17. No year. It didn't need one. It was a word my bones knew how to pronounce. Anna finally glanced up. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, the syllable too quick. "Old high school photo. Someone must have found it." I tucked the picture back into the envelope before she could approach, as if it were indecent, as if it would expose a part of me I'd carefully clothed for 20 years. Emily tugged my sleeve. "Daddy, stars?" "Always," I said, and cut the second piece of toast. The knife went through with a whisper. I thought of another knife, smaller, dirtier, and of a tin that had scraped against stone. The memory surfaced like a drowned thing and then sank, thrashing once and vanishing. On my commute, I told myself stories I could believe, a reunion, a prank, a sentimental gesture from a friend I'd lost to time. In the office, the photograph weighed down my briefcase like a lead charm. Blueprints blurred as I stared through them. I misdrew 2 lines, caught myself, erased them. I measured a corridor twice and found 2 different answers. "Rough night?" my coworker Seth asked as the plotter spit out a fresh sheet with a sigh. "Didn't sleep," I said, true in a way I hadn't yet earned. By evening, the envelope had become a gravity well. I carried it from kitchen counter to dining table to the lamplit corner of the living room, telling myself I'd put it away and then not doing it. After we read Emily her story, a luminous book about a fox who lost his way and then found it. After Anna kissed me goodnight and said, "You're far away tonight." After I lied again and said, "Just tired," I sat alone with the photo like it was a person I owed an apology. I studied my 17-year-old face. He looked like he believed in permanence. He looked like he believed in me. The house settled in winter creaks, though it wasn't winter. The refrigerator hummed and clicked. Somewhere outside, a car door thudded with the mute softness of distance. I pressed my thumb to the edge of the photograph until the paper cut me, and I welcomed the sting. It was proof that I was here, now, in this well-lit room, with nothing to fear but a piece of paper. Then the knock came. 3 slow taps, spaced like measured speech. I could have pretended not to hear. I could have moved quietly up the stairs and slipped into bed and told myself it had been the wind. But you don't bury a shovel and expect the ground to hold it. I opened the door. "Hey, ma'am," Darren said. Time had not been kind to him, or he to time. The boy I remembered was knife-bright eyes and perpetual motion. The man on my stoop was a rumor of himself. He was thinner, his cheeks scooped out. His skin had the gray tinge of someone who hadn't slept inside the night that the rest of us did. His smile, if that's what he meant it to be, was a line he couldn't quite lift. "You look like you've seen a ghost," I said. The joke fell between us like a bad coin. "It's time," he answered, and the way he said it made the hallway behind me feel smaller. For what? The pact. Behind him, the world smelled like wet concrete. I stood aside. He walked in like he'd been here before, and paused in the wash of light from the living room, taking in the framed photos on the wall. Emily at the beach, Anna and me at our wedding, a shot of the house before we painted it, with an expression I couldn't read. "Nice life," he said, not as a compliment, as an inventory. "What are you doing here, Darren?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I already knew. "We are bound," I heard, not with my ears. Darren looked up. "We need to talk before it starts." "What starts?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I already knew.
Chapter 2. The First Return. After Darren left, or after I told him he couldn't stay and he agreed without agreeing, I stood in the doorway a long time, the night leaning into the frame, the cold testing the threshold like an animal. He'd said he'd be in touch. He'd said not to tell anyone. He'd said soon, in a way that meant now. I locked the door and checked it twice, then a third time when I reached the base of the stairs, ashamed of the ritual and performing it anyway. In bed, Anna turned toward me in the soft dark. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, and when I didn't elaborate, she let the word be what it wanted to be. Anna has always known the difference between questions that ask for answers and questions that ask for presence. She pressed her palm to my chest as if she could steady my heart from the outside. Eventually, her breathing slowed. Mine never did. At some black hour between midnight and dawn, I went back downstairs. The house at night was a different house, the edges softer, the distances longer. The photograph on the table felt like a lit window in an unlit street. I sat and tried to stitch the past to the present with thread that wouldn't hold. 17 had been a costume that looked like skin. We were loud with the certainty of people who haven't yet paid for anything. We had a barn and a bottle and a summer that felt like proof of eternity. That night in the forest had been a dare we told ourselves was a ceremony. You can forgive children for wanting magic. You can't forgive the magic for wanting them back. I don't know when I fell asleep, only that I woke to a sound that was not a sound, a pressure on the air, a change in the temperature of the room. It was just after midnight because the microwave clock still read 12:03 in its stubborn neon. The knock that followed was not a repeat. It was different. 3 again, but heavier, like someone leaning into the wood. I stood with the carefulness of a man balancing a full glass. This is absurd, I thought. This is the ridiculous theater of superstition. But superstition is just a word for patterns you don't want to admit you see. I opened the door a few inches, chain still hooked. There was no one there. The porch seemed to exhale. On the doormat lay a second envelope. No handwriting, no address, just the same thick paper, the same deliberate weight. I slid the chain free and stepped out onto the porch boards that complained like old men. The street was empty. The sky had a bruise at its edge. I picked up the envelope and felt the cold in the paper. Inside was not a photograph, but a photocopy, gray on gray, cheap and hasty, of a newspaper clipping. The headline was a sentence I understood before I read it. Local woman dies in single-car accident. The grainy image beside it was a woman with hair cropped close, eyes bright even in newsprint. Emily. The caption used her married name. I didn't know it until that moment and somehow resented her for keeping it from me, as if I were entitled to the past's roll call. My knees went soft. I sat on the top steps and felt the night settle around me. The article blamed rain that hadn't come and a curve that had bent countless other cars, but claimed only hers. No mention of another vehicle, no mention of skid marks. Accidents are stories we tell ourselves about physics. This was not physics. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt. I thought of Emily's laugh, the small, surprised kind that sounded like she'd found a coin, and of the day we all went swimming at the quarry and she wouldn't jump from the rock until I did, and then did without closing her eyes. I thought of the way she'd looked that night in the forest, candlelight turning her into someone older who knew better. When I went back inside, I washed my face at the kitchen sink and stared at myself in the black mirror of the window. A man looked back who had built a life atop a buried thing, and now felt the ground sink an inch, then another. The next day I couldn't keep my hand still. I lost my keys twice and found them where I'd left them. I drafted a wall 5 inches thicker than any code would allow. Seth offered to take the meeting with the client. I said no, and then yes, and then no, and finally yes, and he gave me the kind of look that says, "I'm worried about you," without the insult of words. I took the elevator alone and watched my reflection dissolve in the brushed steel as floors flicked past, numbers like a count I couldn't interrupt. I called Darren 3 times and hung up before it connected. On the 4th, I let it ring. He answered on the first tone. "You saw it," he said, not asking.
When? 2 days ago. Why didn't you tell me last night? Would you have believed me? I thought of the photocopied slab of a headline. No,
I admitted. There's more, he said. Don't, I said, standing suddenly, the chair legs screeching on tile. My coworkers glanced over, eyebrows up, smiles pasted on to show they weren't eavesdropping. I walked into the stairwell with its damp concrete smell and its echoing emptiness. Don't say it here. Tonight, Darren said. We can't do this over phones. Do what? Begin not dying, he said, and hung up. I went home early and told Anna I was working late. The particular shame of the lie was that it wore an old, familiar coat. I had lied at 17 with the same precise casualness, and the lie had slid into place again like a well-oiled drawer. She kissed me at the door and said, "Don't let them make you redraw the whole thing." And I wanted to say, "They already did." At 11:57 p.m., there was no knock. At 12:01, my phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. Back door. I went to the kitchen and stood with my hand on the knob, listening for the indifferent sounds of the house. I opened it, and the cold slapped my face like an accusation. Darren slipped in, shutting the door behind him with an intimacy that made me bristle. He looked worse in the fluorescent kitchen light, bruised under the eyes, an unhealthy sheen to his skin, a tremor at the edge of his mouth. "Coffee?" I asked, because hospitality is a script we read when we don't know our lines. "Please," he said, and sat at the table, the chair complaining under his sudden weight. While the machine hissed and clicked, he spoke without looking at me. "Emily's not an outlier. She's a beginning. You sound like a preacher. I sound like a man who knows a countdown when he hears it." "From who?" He didn't answer. He pulled an object from his pocket and set it on the table, a small flat stone with a chipped edge. It was nothing, and it was everything. "You went back," I said. The coffee machine sighed. The kitchen smelled like bitterness. I had to know if it was still there. "And?" He didn't touch the stone again. "The rock is the same. The clearing is the same. The feeling is worse." "You dug?" I didn't have to. Something moved, like dirt settling, like an animal burrowing away from me. I poured 2 cups and burned my tongue on the first sip, as if pain could pin me to the moment. "You're not making sense." He finally met my eyes. "We made rules that night, or we were given them. You remember?" "I remember words I pretended not to understand." He nodded. One of them was, "You do not return." Another was, "You do not talk." Another was, "You do not leave each other behind." "That last one," I said, and my voice broke on it. "We failed before dawn." Darren flinched like I'd slapped him. "We were kids. I was responsible," I said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." He rubbed his face hard enough to leave his skin blotched. "We don't have to agree about what we were. We have to agree about what we are." "And what's that?" "4. And falling." I thought of Lisa's poster-perfect smile, of Kyle's laugh that always arrived a second before the punchline, eager to find the joke. I thought of Emily's cautious eyes in newsprint. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing you wanted from me when you opened the door," he said simply. "To not be alone in this." Outside, a car rolled past, tires whispering on the damp road. Inside, the kitchen clock resumed its liturgy. Midnight has a way of making decisions for you, while pretending you're the one speaking. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow night. We bring them together." "Lisa and Kyle?" "And what's left of us," he said. "Where?" He smiled without joy. "Where else?" he said. halfway back.
Chapter 3: Shadows in the Past. Memory doesn't play fair. It doesn't spool in order, scene to scene, a neat film you can screen. It flickers. It repeats. It holds on the moment you'd skip and fast forwards through things you'd pay to rewatch. When I finally lay down that night, the past didn't invite me so much as unbolt a door and drag me through. We were 5, and we were invincible, and we were so very breakable. Kyle's dad's barn smelled of hay and motor oil, the scent of work that hadn't been done in years. Dust floated in the beam of a single bare bulb, lazy galaxies spinning in our small universe. Someone had found a deck of cards sticky with age. Someone had found a bottle of whiskey with a label that promised Kentucky and delivered gasoline. Darren told the story like he'd been born to tell stories, with the cadence of a boy who believes that the world rearranges itself to fit the shape of his words. The Black Wood Pact, he intoned, and Lisa rolled her eyes in a way that made the name itself feel ridiculous and frightening at once. Urban legend, she said. Perfect mouth around imperfect syllables. People go into the woods, cut their fingers, say some nonsense, get spooked, go home, see things for a week, grow up, forget. Darren leaned back in the rickety chair until it creaked. People don't forget, he said. They pretend. Different sport. Emily sat cross-legged on a hay bale, hands jammed into the sleeves of her sweatshirt. She wasn't scared, not exactly. Cautious. She absorbed and considered, and only then spoke, which made everything she said sound like it had already been tested for truth. "Where'd you hear it?" "Old man at the bait shop," Darren said, and Kyle snorted. "What? You think the internet invented stories?" He told me it wasn't just a pact, it was a trade. You bring something, you get something. But you bring it together or it doesn't stick. "And what do we get?" I asked, though back then I didn't believe you had to name your wanting to be governed by it. Darren let the chair drop forward with a thump. "That's the thing," he said. "You don't have to agree." "You're full of—" Kyle began, and Darren pulled out the shoebox like a magician producing a dove you hoped would be a rabbit. Inside, 5 stubby candles, a small rusty tin the size of a man's palm, a folded paper gone soft at the creases. He handled the objects with an odd delicacy that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't reverence. It was care. It was belonging. "Where'd you get those?" Emily asked. "Borrowed," he said. "From the old man?" Darren smiled and didn't answer. He had a talent for turning a refusal into an invitation.
We went because we always went where the dare led. The woods began behind the quarry road, where the broken gate leaned inward like a drunk. The trees at the edge were younger, thinner, standing shoulder to shoulder as if keeping something in behind them. The deeper trees were older, thick with rings and secrets. The night swallowed the sounds that should have been there. Insects, a distant train, the occasional bark of a dog you never saw, and left our footsteps too loud. The air had the temperature of a held breath. I can lead you there now, past the shattered bottle no one ever cleaned up, past the stump the shape of a chair, to the clearing that isn't a circle but feels like one, The ground flat because the trees decided it would be. In the center, the rock, flat and wide as a low altar, worn smooth where water had learned a path. We lit the candles with a single cheap lighter that struggled against a wind that wasn't. The flames steadied, surprised to find themselves alive. The clearing took on a shape it didn't have a second earlier. Shadows moved to the edges like spectators. I remember noticing how the wax beaded and cooled on the candle's sides, like the trees were sweating. "Hold out your hand," Darren said to me, and produced the pocket knife. I didn't flinch because I was 17, and 17 doesn't bleed until someone asks if it hurts. He nicked my finger, a kiss of pain, bright and clean, and did the same to the others. Our blood welled obediently. He opened the tin, and the smell that came out was iron and damp and something like penny dust. "It's already in there," I said, throat dry. He nodded. "It needs to be mixed." "What is it?" Lisa asked, not because she feared the answer, but because she wanted to catalog the danger. "The old man called it a binding," Darren said, and in the corner of my eye I saw Emily's shoulders tighten, a small twin to the motion I made. He said words matter more when they have weight. We let the drops fall into the tin, slow and ridiculous and solemn. The sound they made was obscene in its softness. He unfolded the paper and began to read. The language was not the language of the bait shop. It had edges I didn't recognize, syllables that seemed to bend around each other. The hair on my arms lifted as if listening. "Stop," Emily said once, softly, and Darren didn't. When he finished the first paragraph, the candles shifted as if a door had opened. Not flickered, shifted together, their flames leaning toward the tin like a plant toward a window. He closed the lid and set the tin on the rock. For a moment, nothing. Then the smallest sound, like something settling in dirt, a sigh in the ground. "Say it," Darren told us, and we did, because the air had filled with a command that made disobedience feel childish. "We are bound," we said, quietly. "Break it, and it will break you." I don't know how long we stood there after. Time thickened, then thinned. Kyle laughed first, too loud. "Congratulations," he said, voice high. "We're married to a rock." Lisa blew out her candle with a sigh of relief she didn't bother to hide. "I'm cold," she said, which was her way of leaving without admitting fear. Emily didn't move. She stared at the rock like it was a page and she'd missed a line. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were older than her face. She said, "Let's go." On the way back, we broke apart without meaning to, 2 ahead, then 3 behind, then 2 and 2 and 1, then 5 again at the edge of the trees as if we'd practiced it. I remember the sound of the road like salvation. I remember the barn light and the ordinary music on Kyle's radio, and the way laughter returned like something guilty climbing back in through a window. What I don't remember is where we put the knife. I don't remember where the paper went. or if it matters who took the tin originally. I remember a feeling like certainty wearing a mask I couldn't name. And then, morning, sun on dust. My mother calling me to mow a lawn that felt infinite. The pact already a story that hadn't happened yet. Back in the present, the memory let me go with a little tear like fabric caught on a nail. The alarm on my phone said 6:15 a.m. The house smelled of coffee. Anna's footsteps were the best part of waking, still. Emily's laughter floated down the stairs like a note on a string. For a full, sharp second, I believed in the possibility of ignoring everything. Then my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize and a message that said, "Tonight, 9, the old cabin." The address that followed was one we'd used as kids to smoke and lie and plan futures we hadn't earned. Halfway back, as Darren had promised. I typed OK and deleted it, and typed fine and deleted that, and finally wrote nothing and slid the phone into my pocket with the cowardice of consent. At work, I lasted until noon and then left without telling anyone. I drove out of the city in a steady stream of cars, the winter bare trees along the highway like ribs around an animal's heart. The cabin sat where it always had, pretending to be abandoned and failing. The porch sagged, the windows grimed up, but the door still held a shine where hands had insisted on entering. I sat in the car with the engine off and watched my breath fog the windshield. I thought about turning around. I thought about calling Anna and telling her, what? That I was a man divided by a line I'd drawn at 17? That I was about to cross back over it? The first car pulled in behind me with its lights off. Lisa stepped out in a coat that cost more than the cabin, heels not designed for the gravel, face set in the expression of a woman who arrives places because she decided to, and not a second late. She glanced at me and then beyond me, toward the trees, and for a moment the carefully arranged parts of her faltered. Another car. Kyle, wearing the same grin and a different life. He had a duffel bag that looked like it had been thrown at him and a jacket with a rip at the shoulder. He raised 2 fingers in a salute that meant, "Don't ask me how I am." Darren emerged last from the edge of the property on foot, not from a car at all, as if he'd been living in the margins of the map. He looked at our little assembly and nodded once, something like relief passing across his face, and then gone. We didn't hug. We didn't smile. We stood in front of the door like penitents, and then one by one went inside to sit at a table that remembered our elbows. No one spoke first. The silence was a living thing, testing each of us, deciding whose throat it would climb down. Finally, Lisa said, "Emily," and the name did what silence couldn't. It broke us open.
Chapter 4. The Rules of the Pact. Lisa didn't say, "Emily is dead." She didn't have to. The name alone was enough. It hung in the air like a chime struck once and left to vibrate. Darren stared at the tabletop as if something were carved into it, something only he could read. Kyle shifted in his chair, the legs scraping over the wooden floor in an uneven rhythm. "She's gone," Lisa said, softer now,
And that was the knife turning. I saw the report. Car accident. Rain on a clear night. No other vehicles. No witnesses. Kyle snorted, a brittle, ugly sound. Yeah, well, people die. That's life. Doesn't mean ghosts are crawling out of the woods to take us one by one. Darren's head lifted. You think this is coincidence? Kyle shrugged, but his jaw tightened. I think you've been living in your own horror movie for too long. I leaned back, trying to keep my voice even. Tell us what you know, Darren. No more fragments. He nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was more like resignation. The pact wasn't just some teenage ritual. It had rules. The old man who gave me the tin told me that. When you bind yourselves together, you're bound completely. You don't walk away. You don't talk about it to anyone outside the circle. And you don't go back to the clearing. Lisa's eyes narrowed. And what happens if you do? Darren's gaze found mine. Then it finds you. Kyle rolled his eyes. It, sure, big scary it. What is it exactly? I don't know, Darren said, but I know it doesn't stop. No one spoke after that. The cabin's silence pressed down, thick with the smell of damp wood and old dust. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked. Not the quick snap of wind, but the deliberate sound of weight. I glanced toward the window, but the night beyond was opaque. Lisa broke the stillness. If these rules are real, then we've already broken them. We haven't been in contact for years. We've told people pieces of the story. And, she hesitated, her eyes flicking to Darren. One of us went back. Darren didn't deny it. He didn't even look ashamed. It was already moving. I needed to see. Kyle stood abruptly, pacing. This is insane. You two are insane. I came here because I thought you wanted a drink, catch up, maybe talk about old times, not sit around playing Ghost Story. You came here because you got an envelope, Darren said, his voice sharp enough to cut. Kyle froze. The look on his face told me Darren was right.
Chapter 5. The Gathering. We stayed in the cabin because leaving felt wrong, dangerous. Like a moment we stepped outside, whatever thread still tied us together would snap, and something would follow the loose ends straight to us. Lisa poured herself a drink from a bottle that had been sitting unopened in the corner, the liquid amber in the lamplight. She didn't offer any to the rest of us. Kyle sat again, but kept his hands restless, tapping on the table, picking at a frayed thread in his sleeve, drumming his fingers against his knee. I think we need to be honest, really honest, about that night. Darren shot her a warning look. We already— No, she interrupted, her tone sharp. We told each other the safe version, the one that fits in our heads without tearing us apart. But it's not the truth. Groan, here we go. Lisa ignored him. She fixed her gaze on me. You remember, don't you? Her voice was soft, but the question was a hook. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The truth was slippery, coated in 20 years of denial. You think what happened was an accident, that we just played some stupid game and scared ourselves, but it wasn't an accident. I frowned. What are you saying? She looked at Darren. Tell him. Darren shifted in his chair, suddenly smaller. The old man didn't give me the ritual for free. He said it needed 5, exactly 5. And he said the pact wouldn't hold unless a debt was paid.
Kyle laughed, short and humorless. A debt? What, we sacrifice a goat in the middle of the woods? No, Darren said quietly. Something living. Something that mattered. The memory hit me like a flashbulb, quick, searing. The rustle in the trees, the sound like a yelp choked off, the sudden stillness after. Lisa's voice cut through the fog. And it wasn't an accident. I wanted to argue, to push the memory back into the dark where it belonged, but the harder I tried, the clearer it became. The old man's voice, low, deliberate, telling Darren that power had to come from somewhere. Darren's insistence that we just found the animal already hurt. Emily's pale face in the candlelight, her hands shaking as she looked at the tin. Lisa leaned forward, her eyes cold. You knew exactly what you were doing. I didn't know it would stay. I thought it was just part of the show. You thought wrong, Lisa snapped. And now it's come to collect. Kyle stood again, but this time it wasn't restless energy. It was anger. You dragged us into this, Darren, all of us, and now Emily's gone, and you think we're next? Darren didn't flinch. I know we're next. Outside the wind shifted, carrying a sound with it, faint, almost a whisper. At first I thought it was the creak of a tree, but it came again, closer this time. Words I couldn't quite make out, old, unfamiliar. The same ones Darren had read from the paper 20 years ago. Kyle swore under his breath, I'm leaving. No, Darren said sharply. You leave now, you won't make it through the night. Kyle laughed, but it was shaky. Watch me. He grabbed his duffel, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for the door. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. When the door swung open, cold air rushed in like a living thing. Kyle stepped into the dark without looking back. The door closed behind him. We never saw him again.
Chapter 7. Breaking the Pact. We didn't speak for a long time after Kyle left. The cabin seemed to grow larger in his absence, the shadows stretching, the spaces between our breaths widening. The wind outside had died completely, leaving the world unnaturally still. Lisa sat rigid, hands clasped around her glass, eyes fixed on the door, as if Kyle might stroll back in with some sarcastic remark. Darren leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it was a map. I found myself listening for the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, for the car door slamming, for the growl of the engine. Nothing came. When I finally spoke, my voice was low. We can't just wait here. Darren lifted his head slowly. You think moving will help? I think doing nothing will kill us faster. Lisa set her glass down with a soft clink. So what's your plan? You think we can, break it? The word felt dangerous in my mouth. Maybe, if we undo what we did that night. You can't undo blood, Darren interrupted. His tone wasn't angry, just tired. Not when it's been bound. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Then we change the terms. Darren frowned, but I could see the thought take root. Lisa's gaze shifted between us. What are you talking about? The pact was made to tie us together. Maybe if we go back, all of us, and, I don't know, burn the tin, destroy the rock. The rules, Darren shook his head, are already broken. I said, if the thing's coming for us anyway, what's the point of following them now? Silence settled again, heavier this time. Darren's jaw tightened. If we do this,
We have one shot, and if we get it wrong, we're dead, Lisa finished for him. We all knew she was right, but the thought of sitting in that cabin, waiting for whatever took Emily and Kyle, felt worse than walking into the forest unarmed. Finally, Darren nodded once. Tomorrow night, we go back to the clearing. Chapter 8. The Final Night. We didn't sleep. The cabin's air felt thick, damp, like a storm was gathering inside its walls. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep in the hall. Every whisper of wind against the windows sounded like a voice just beyond hearing. At some point, Lisa moved to sit by the fire, staring into the flames like she was trying to read them. Darren stayed by the table, methodically cleaning a hunting knife he'd pulled from his pack. I paced, unable to sit still. By the time the sky began to lighten, the decision felt like a weight in the center of the room. We packed in silence. Darren insisted on bringing salt, matches, a length of rope, and a small crowbar. Lisa slipped a silver locket around her neck. I didn't ask why, and she didn't offer. We left the cabin just before dusk, following the old quarry road. The trees closed around us, the air cooling with every step. It wasn't long before the sounds of the world, the hum of distant traffic, the calls of night birds, faded entirely. When we reached the clearing, it looked almost exactly as it had 20 years ago. The rock sat in the center, smooth and flat, with a faint dark stain in the middle. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing had dared grow there in decades. Darren moved first, kneeling by the rock. He ran a hand over its surface, then tapped it twice with the crowbar. A hollow sound answered. Lisa stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder at the tree line. "We're not alone." I turned and saw nothing, but the air shifted. Denser, colder, like the forest itself was leaning in to watch. "Do it," I said. Darren wedged the crowbar under the edge of the rock and heaved. The stone lifted with a groan, revealing a shallow pit beneath. The tin sat in the center, just as I remembered, rusted, dented, but intact. Lisa stepped forward, holding the matches. "Once this burns," a whisper cut her off. Not from behind us, from beneath. It wasn't just a voice, it was voices, layered and overlapping, speaking in that same unfamiliar language from all those years ago. The sound crawled up my spine. "Burn it!" I shouted. Lisa struck a match, and it went out instantly, as if the air had been sucked away. She tried again. The same. Darren swore, grabbing the tin with his bare hands, and hissed in pain where his fingers touched the metal. The voices grew louder, filling the clearing, the trees, my head. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was inside me now, pounding with my heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I looked up, and the tin was gone.
Chapter 9. What was left? For a moment, none of us moved. The pit was empty, the rock still tilted to the side. The only sign the tin had ever been there was the smell, metallic, burnt, wrong. "Where is it?" Lisa's face had gone pale. Darren shook his head slowly. "It was never ours to destroy." Something moved in the tree line. Not an animal, not a person. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, the limbs bending at angles that made my stomach twist. It didn't step into the clearing. It didn't need to. "We have to go," I said, but my voice was barely more than a whisper. Darren didn't argue, Lisa didn't either. We backed away, eyes fixed on the trees, until the clearing disappeared behind us. By the time we reached the cabin, the night had deepened into something heavy, suffocating. Inside, we locked the door and sat together in the dark. No one spoke. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. At some point, I realized the sounds outside had stopped completely. Lisa finally broke the silence. So, what now? No one answered. In the corner, Darren stared at his burned hands. I stared at the floor. Lisa stared at the dark window. We didn't see Kyle again. We didn't see the tin again. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear it, that whisper, low and insistent, curling just at the edge of my thoughts. And I know the pact isn't broken. It's only waiting.